Hello and welcome to your COVIDENCE UK webinar for November 2021. My name's Adrian Martineau, and with me today is Hayley Holt, the principal investigator of the study, who will be sharing some new findings with you. So the question that we're really frequently getting asked in recent weeks is, if I have symptoms following my vaccination against COVID-19, does that mean that I'm better protected against the virus? And so what we've done in the analysis we're going to present today is put together the information that you've given us about your symptoms. We've linked that to the information that we got from the dried blood spots antibody tests to answer that question. And today, Hayley's been running that analysis and she's going to take you through the data. So Hayley, over to you.
Nice. Thank you, Adrian. So as you said, I'm going to be discussing today post-vaccination symptoms and how they relate to antibody responses. So before I get into the three main questions we're going to answer today, I'm first going to take you through a little bit of background context, like who was involved in the study and what symptoms specifically we were looking at. So first, who is included? There were 9,003 people eligible for this study. The average age was 61 years old, and we were 73% female and 27% male. We have a really nice breakdown of vaccine type. So we've got just under 6,000 people who had 2 doses of AstraZeneca, around 3,000 people who had 2 doses of Pfizer, 59 people who had 2 doses of Moderna, and 90 people who had 2 doses of another vaccine. We also looked at pre-vaccination COVID status. So out of the 9,003 people in this study, 84.5% of them were antibody negative, 10.6% of them were antibody positive but were asymptomatic or had no symptoms, and 4.5% of them were antibody positive and were symptomatic. So now I'm just going to discuss the two types of symptoms that we're looking at following vaccination. The first is systemic. So systemic symptoms will be feeling tired or fatigue, headache, fever, and muscle aches. And the local symptoms that we're looking at are tenderness, soreness, swelling, redness, or pain at the injection site. So now that we've got a bit of the background context here, I'm going to go into the three main questions that I'm going to be answering during this presentation. The first being, how common are symptoms after vaccination? Then we're going to look at what are the risk factors for getting symptoms. And finally, we're going to look at, do these symptoms associate with the strength of the antibody response? So the first one we're going to get into is, how common are these symptoms? So this panel here is looking at systemic symptoms following 72 hours after vaccination. So we've got 3 different vaccine types here. The blue column, we have AstraZeneca. The orange column, we have Pfizer, and in the green column, we have Moderna. So we can see here that 61% of people who had AstraZeneca had systemic symptoms, 41% of people who had a Pfizer vaccine had systemic symptoms, and 9% of people who had Moderna had systemic symptoms. And now we're going to compare that to the local symptoms here. So you can see that 46% of people who had AstraZeneca had local symptoms, 58% of people who had Pfizer had local symptoms, and 10% of people who had Moderna had local symptoms. So the takeaway from this screen is really that you can see that those who had AstraZeneca as a vaccine were more likely to have systemic symptoms. Those who had Pfizer were more likely to develop local symptoms. And those who had Moderna were less likely to have systemic or local symptoms. So the next question we're going to be looking at are, what are the risk factors for getting these symptoms? So again, these are looking at, the first one is going to be sex assigned at birth. So we've got the risk of systemic symptoms is 43% lower in men as compared to women. And the risk of local symptoms is 50% lower in men as compared to women. Now, the next risk factor we're going to be looking at is age. So risk for systemic symptoms is 42% lower in those who are over 70 years old as compared to those who are under 30. And the risk for local symptoms is 90% lower in those who are over 70 versus those who are under 30. The next risk factor is going to be self-rated general health. So the risk of systemic symptoms is 52% higher in those who have poor versus excellent self-rated general health. And the risk of local symptoms is 42% higher in those who have poor versus excellent self-rated general health. And the last risk factor we're going to be looking at today is having had a prior COVID-19 infection. So the risk of systemic symptoms is 123% higher if you had a prior symptomatic COVID-19 infection. And interestingly, we don't see a difference if your prior COVID-19 infection was asymptomatic or you had no symptoms associated. And now the risk of local symptoms is 84% higher if you had a prior symptomatic COVID-19 infection. And again, there was no difference if your prior infection was asymptomatic. Now we're going to be looking at the last question here, which is, do these symptoms associate with the strength of the antibody response? And the answer is they do. So we're going to be looking at two types of vaccines here, AstraZeneca and Pfizer, and we're going to further break that down into symptom type, looking at systemic and local symptoms post-vaccination. So if you had an AstraZeneca vaccine and you had systemic symptoms, you have a 14% higher antibody level and a 39% lower risk of having an undetectable antibody response following vaccination. Now, if you had AstraZeneca and you had a local symptom, then you had a 15% higher antibody level and a 52% lower risk of having an undetectable antibody response. Now, looking at Pfizer, if you had systemic symptoms, you had an 8% higher antibody level and no difference in the risk of an undetectable antibody response. And for local, you have a 22% higher antibody level and no difference in the risk of undetectable antibody responses following vaccination. So you might be asking yourself, what does this all mean? And I'm going to leave you with some key take-home messages. The first being systemic symptoms are more common with AstraZeneca, local symptoms are more common with Pfizer, and post-vaccination symptoms do associate with a higher antibody response. So with that, I would like to say thank you for watching and thank you to everybody who contributed to this research. We are so grateful for all of your contributions, and please continue because we are learning so much from all of your information. So thank you very much, and with that, I'll hand you over to Adrian.
Thanks very much, Hayley. That was crystal clear, and I think a really good illustration of how we've managed to put together the data from your questionnaires with the data from your antibody data to generate new insights into responses to vaccination. Just a final note, one of the questions we're frequently getting asked, particularly from people who've had undetectable antibody responses after vaccination, which is around about 4% of you. Can I have another antibody test following my booster jab? I'm pleased to say we've managed to get some funding for this study, and so in the weeks and months ahead, we'll be sending out invitations for repeat antibody tests to those of you who had undetectable antibody levels following your initial course of vaccination. But that's all for the weeks and months ahead. For now, I just want to add my thanks to those of Hayley. So thanks to all of you for continuing to take part in the study, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. Goodbye for now.